The auction room on Bond Street smelled of old leather and beeswax on that grey April morning in 1818, the air thick with the quiet anticipation of collectors and the whispered assessments of those who came merely to observe. Miss Eleanor Ashworth sat near the back, her serviceable brown dress doing nothing to distinguish her from the room's mahogany panelling, her gloved hands folded precisely in her lap as she waited for lot number 47 to be called. At 29, she had long since grown accustomed to the particular quality of invisibility that settled over unmarried women of uncertain age and unremarkable appearance, that curious social death that allowed her to move through spaces like this without drawing notice or comment. Her face, she knew, was too angular for beauty, her figure too thin for fashion, and her manner too serious for charm. A tally she had made peace with years ago when she understood that her father's scholarship would be her inheritance rather than his fortune. The manuscript she awaited was a 14th-century herbal, its pages filled with botanical illustrations and medieval Latin annotations that had consumed her thoughts since she had viewed it 3 days prior during the preview hours. She had calculated precisely how much of her quarterly allowance she could sacrifice, had determined the maximum bid that would not leave her unable to purchase lamp oil or writing paper, and had steeled herself for the likelihood of disappointment. When the auctioneer finally announced the lot, Eleanor felt her spine straighten almost imperceptibly, her attention sharpening as the bidding began at £20 and sounds. She entered at 35, her paddle rising with a steadiness that belied the quick beating of her heart. The competition came swiftly, a gentleman's voice from the front calling 40, then 45, then 50, as Eleanor continued to counter with the calm persistence of someone who had little to lose and much to gain. It was only when the bidding reached £75, well beyond what she should spend but not quite beyond what she could, that she noticed the turning of heads, the curious glances cast backward to identify who dared continue. The gentleman bidding against her was Viscount William Harcourt. She realized with a cold wash of recognition, his tall frame and dark hair visible now as he turned slightly, perhaps wondering himself who persisted in challenging him. At £80, Eleanor bid again, her voice steady, despite the recklessness of the sum. At 85, the Viscount paused, and in that pause Eleanor felt the weight of the room's attention, heard the faint whisper from 2 seats over, saw the Viscount's eyes finally locate her in the shadows. At £90, she bid a final time, and when the silence stretched and the auctioneer's gavel fell, Eleanor experienced a fierce swell of triumph that shocked her with its intensity. She rose to complete the purchase, aware of the whispers that followed her to the clerk's desk, the speculation about who she might be and what eccentricity drove her to such expense. But she clutched the wrapped manuscript to her chest with steady hands and moved toward the exit. She did not see the way Viscount Harcourt watched her departure, his expression arrested somewhere between surprise and something more complex. Nor could she know that in outbidding him she had accomplished something no one had managed in recent memory, capturing the complete attention of a man thoroughly bored by everything London offered. Eleanor's townhouse on Welbeck Street was modest by the standards of fashionable London, a narrow building with 3 floors and windows that looked onto a quiet street where tradesmen passed more frequently than carriages. The library occupied the entire ground floor, her father's collection lining walls painted a deep green that absorbed the afternoon light and made the room feel like a sanctuary removed from the world's judgment. Here, surrounded by volumes on natural philosophy and botanical studies, by her father's careful annotations in the margins of texts he had loved, Eleanor felt the particular peace that came from knowing exactly what she was and finding it sufficient. She had arranged the medieval manuscript on her desk that evening, the April rain pattering against the windows as she carefully turned its vellum pages, tracing the delicate illustrations of medicinal herbs with one finger, while her other hand made notes in her commonplace book. Her father had taught her Latin and Greek before most girls learned French, had taken her on botanical expeditions through the countryside when other daughters were learning watercolors, and though his death 5 years prior had left her with more knowledge than money, She could not regret the education that now formed the entire substance of her existence. Society had long since dismissed her as peculiar, too educated for marriage, and too poor for consequence, a woman who attended scientific lectures instead of balls, and who could discuss Linnaean classification, but not the latest fashions. She had made her peace with spinsterhood at 25, had understood that her path would be solitary but intellectually rich, and had found in that resignation a kind of freedom that many women of greater beauty and fortune never knew. The manuscript represented months of sacrifice, dinners reduced to bread and cheese, new gloves foregone. Her one luxury purchased at the cost of many small deprivations. But as she studied the medieval herbalist's careful observations about the properties of foxglove and monkshood, she felt the expense justified in ways no one who had whispered about her at the auction house could possibly understand. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, brought tea at 6 and mentioned that the butcher's boy had spoken of some excitement at the auction house on Bond Street, something about the building being sold entire to a private buyer for a sum that suggested either madness or money beyond counting. Eleanor listened with half an ear, more interested in deciphering a particularly faded annotation, and thought nothing of it until 3 days later when a letter arrived bearing an unfamiliar seal. The auction house, she read with growing bewilderment, had indeed been purchased by an anonymous collector, and all records of sales and buyers were now the property of this individual, a detail conveyed to her only because, as a recent purchaser, she might wish to know that her transaction details were now held privately rather than by the firm. Eleanor set the letter down slowly, a small, cold thread of unease winding through her chest as she wondered what manner of person purchased an entire establishment, and whether her own unremarkable name now sat in some stranger's ledger, her small rebellion of £90 recorded for eyes she could not anticipate. The study in Viscount William Harcourt's Mayfair residence was a room that reflected its owner's contradictions, lined with books that ranged from agricultural treatises to philosophy, furnished with pieces collected more for interest than fashion, and overlooking a garden that he actually used rather than simply maintained for appearance. At 34, William had long since wearied of the predictable rhythms of society, the endless succession of balls where every conversation followed the same patterns. The young women paraded before him who had been trained to please rather than to think, the assumption that his wealth and title made him perpetually available for whatever entertainment the ton deemed suitable. He had developed a reputation for unconventionality, investing in manufactories that other gentlemen considered beneath their notice, reading scientific papers that bored his peers to distraction, and maintaining a stubborn independence that his mother had despaired of before her death 2 years prior. The woman at the auction had arrested his attention so completely that he had spent the following days unable to dismiss her from his thoughts, replaying the steady determination in her voice as she bid against him, the way she had clutched that manuscript as though it contained something more valuable than gold, the utter absence of coquetry or social calculation in her manner. He had returned to the auction house the next morning, intending merely to inquire about her identity, but when the proprietor proved reluctant to share details of his clients, William had found himself making an offer for the entire establishment, a sum so absurd that the man had required smelling salts and 20 minutes to recover his composure sufficiently to accept. His man of business had questioned his sanity, his friends would certainly mock him if they learned of it, but William had acquired what he wanted. The records that showed Miss Eleanor Ashworth of Welbeck Street had purchased Lot 7 for £90, a sum that represented either great passion or great recklessness for someone whose address suggested modest circumstances. He had made inquiries, discreet questions posed to those who might know, and had learned that she was the daughter of Professor James Ashworth, deceased scholar of some note in botanical circles, that she lived quietly on a small inheritance, that she was considered peculiar and unmarriageable, that she attended scientific lectures and avoided society almost entirely. Each detail had only deepened his fascination. This woman who had outbid a viscount without apparent concern for consequence, who valued knowledge over social approval, who existed so completely outside the narrow confines of what women were supposed to be that London had simply dismissed her as irrelevant. William sat now in his study with the auction house records before him, her signature on the purchase document, her careful script revealing an educated hand, and felt something he had not experienced in years, a genuine curiosity about another human being, a desire to understand what thoughts moved behind those serious eyes. He would call upon her, he decided, would find some pretext that would not alarm or offend, because the alternative was to let her disappear back into whatever obscure corner of London she inhabited. And that possibility had become suddenly, inexplicably intolerable. The morning was well advanced when Mrs. Brennan appeared in the library doorway with an expression that suggested some disruption to the usual quiet of Welbeck Street, informing Eleanor that a gentleman had called and was even now waiting in the modest front parlour, a room so rarely used that Eleanor had to pause a moment before remembering where she kept it dusted. Viscount Harcourt stood by the window when she entered, his height and fine clothing making the small space seem suddenly smaller, and Eleanor felt her breath catch with the immediate assumption that he had come to claim some error in the auction, some irregularity that would require her to surrender the manuscript she had already begun to love. He turned at her entrance and bowed with a formality that seemed at odds with the frank curiosity in his eyes, expressing his hope that she would forgive the intrusion. But he had a proposition that he believed might be of mutual benefit, and Eleanor found herself gesturing toward the worn settee while her mind raced through possible meanings of such a statement. He did not waste time with pleasantries beyond what courtesy required, explaining that he had a sister, widowed young and now devoted to education, who had expressed profound interest in botanical studies but lacked access to certain rare texts, and he had learned that Miss Ashworth had recently acquired a medieval manuscript of considerable value to such research. Eleanor listened with suspicion threading through her initial alarm, wondering how he had learned of her purchase and what manner of man tracked down a stranger over a book. But when he continued by demonstrating actual knowledge of the manuscript's contents, mentioning the herbalist's observations on cardiac effects of digitalis with the ease of someone who had studied such matters himself, her suspicion began to shade into something more complex. She asked how he knew of her acquisition, and he answered with a directness that might have seemed presumptuous had it not been delivered with such calm assurance, stating that he had purchased the auction house entire because he wished to know who had valued that particular lot enough to outbid him, a statement so extraordinary that Eleanor could only stare at him while her understanding of the situation rearranged itself entirely. He seemed to recognize her shock, and added quickly that his sister's interest was genuine, that Lady Catherine Harcourt maintained a serious study of medicinal plants and their properties, and that he would be willing to compensate Miss Ashworth handsomely for access to the manuscript. But even as he spoke of payment, Eleanor found herself less focused on his words than on the remarkable fact that he discussed the actual content of botanical research, rather than dismissing it as an eccentric hobby, unsuitable for female attention. She heard herself saying that she would need to consider his proposal, that the manuscript was precious to her and she would not risk its damage, but that if his sister's interest was as serious as he claimed, then perhaps some arrangement might be possible, and saw something that looked like satisfaction cross his features. He rose then, thanking her for her time with a courtesy that seemed genuine rather than perfunctory, and asked if he might call again in 3 days to discuss terms, a request that Eleanor granted despite the warning voice in her mind that questioned why a viscount would go to such lengths for a book, why he looked at her with such focused attention, why her careful, solitary life suddenly felt like it was shifting beneath her feet in ways she could not predict or control. The whispers began in drawing rooms where Eleanor had never been welcome and likely never would be, spreading through the invisible networks that connected London society like mycelium beneath forest floor, carrying news that Viscount Harcourt had been seen calling upon the Ashworth spinster, That peculiar woman who dressed a decade out of fashion and attended scientific lectures as though she had any business understanding such matters. In Lady Pembroke's salon on a Thursday afternoon, Miss Caroline Beaumont observed to her particular friends that it must be some eccentricity of the Viscount's, perhaps a wager among the gentlemen to see who could endure the most tedious company, for surely no man of sense would seek out a woman so thoroughly past any hope of matrimony and so singularly lacking in the accomplishments that made female society tolerable. Mrs. Whitmore added with a laugh that perhaps he required assistance with some dreadfully boring agricultural text and had been told the Ashworth woman could actually read such things which would explain his interest in a manner that did not require one to imagine he found her personally appealing, a notion that sent ripples of amusement through the assembled ladies, who agreed that Miss Ashworth's plain features and serious manner would repel any gentleman seeking actual feminine charm. The speculation grew more elaborate as it spread, some suggesting the Viscount had taken pity on her poverty and was offering charity disguised as intellectual consultation, others proposing that he sought her late father's papers for some scholarly project of his own, and a few of the more malicious tongues hinting that perhaps his tastes ran to the peculiar, and he found something amusing in the contrast between his consequence and her insignificance. Eleanor herself remained blessedly unaware of most of this commentary for 3 days, moving through her quiet routines and considering the Viscount's proposal with a careful attention that weighed the value of sharing her precious manuscript against the risk of damage and the strangeness of the entire situation. But on the afternoon before his promised return visit, she attended a lecture at the Royal Society on recent discoveries in mineralogy, one of the few public scientific presentations that admitted ladies to the gallery, and found herself standing near a group of younger women who had clearly come more for social display than scientific edification. She did not mean to listen to their conversation, was in fact attempting to read the published abstract of the lecture, but their voices carried in the way that voices do when their owners believe themselves unobserved by anyone who matters, and she heard her own name spoken with the inflection that made something cold settle in her stomach. Miss Sophia Chambers was saying to her companion that it was quite the joke, really, poor Viscount Harcourt forced to endure the company of that dreadful Ashworth creature, and one could only imagine what favour he owed someone to require such penance, for surely no other explanation sufficed for why a gentleman of his standing would lower himself to call upon a woman who had nothing to recommend her but dusty books and the kind of face that made spinsterhood an inevitability rather than a choice. Eleanor stood very still, her fingers tight on the paper she held, feeling the familiar shame rise up to choke her, that old knowledge that she was insufficient by every measure society valued, too plain, too old, too serious, too entirely herself to ever be acceptable. She left before the lecture began, walking home through streets that seemed suddenly hostile, and by the time she reached Welbeck Street, she had nearly decided to send a note declining any further meetings with the Viscount, protecting herself from whatever humiliation awaited when his true motives revealed themselves as the joke that Miss Chambers and her kind assumed they must be. Eleanor had very nearly convinced herself to send the note of polite decline when the appointed hour arrived, and she heard Mrs. Brennan admitting the Viscount to the front hall, leaving her no time to retreat into cowardice and forcing her to receive him in the library where she had spent the morning attempting to focus on catalogue entries rather than on the poisonous words she had overheard at the lecture. He entered carrying a wooden case that seemed an odd accompaniment to a social call, and after the expected courtesies, he opened it to reveal pressed botanical specimens mounted on heavy paper, each labelled in a precise hand that spoke of genuine scientific care, explaining that he had brought these from his sister's collection to show Miss Ashworth the seriousness of Lady Catherine's study, and perhaps to determine which texts might prove most valuable for her research. Eleanor found herself drawn to the case despite her determination to maintain distance, recognizing immediately the quality of the preservation and the thoughtfulness of the selection. Specimens of medicinal plants arranged not by aesthetic appeal, but by taxonomic relationship, and therapeutic application. And before she quite knew what she was doing, she had pulled the medieval manuscript from its protective wrapping to compare a 15th century illustration of foxglove with the mounted digitalis purpurea before her. The Viscount leaned closer to examine both, commenting on the herbalist's notation about dosage and asking whether Miss Ashworth had seen the recent article in the Philosophical Transactions regarding cardiac applications, and suddenly they were deep in discussion of alkaloid compounds and the challenge of standardizing medicinal preparations, his questions demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond polite interest into genuine understanding of the complexities involved. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest as she listened to him describe his sister's experiments with tincture preparation, heard him use terminology correctly, and reference texts she knew well, saw in his face not the condescension she had learned to expect when men engaged with her intellectual interests, but rather the focused attention of someone who found the subject itself compelling. She forgot to guard her responses, forgot to make herself smaller and less enthusiastic, found herself pulling other volumes from her shelves to illustrate points and counter his observations with her own research, their conversation building in intensity until she was gesturing with her hands, and he was laughing at some particularly absurd claim made by an 18th century physician who had attributed magical properties to perfectly ordinary plants. It was only when Mrs. Brennan knocked to bring tea that Eleanor realized 2 hours had passed, and that she had entirely abandoned the cool formality she had intended to maintain, had in fact been speaking with the Viscount as she might speak with her late father, as an equal mind engaged in mutual exploration of ideas that mattered. He seemed to notice her sudden self-consciousness, and gentled his manner somewhat, thanking her for her time and the opportunity to examine the manuscript. But then he paused at the library door and asked with a directness that caught her unprepared whether he might call upon her again, not for the manuscript, but because he had not enjoyed a conversation so thoroughly in longer than he could remember and would consider it a great privilege to continue their acquaintance. Eleanor stood surrounded by her books and specimens, with the afternoon light slanting through the window, and felt her careful resolutions crumbling beneath the weight of wanting to believe that perhaps this strange situation might be exactly what it appeared, rather than the elaborate joke that Miss Chambers and her kind assumed. And she heard herself giving permission for another visit, even as the warning voice in her mind reminded her that hope had always been the most dangerous indulgence. William arrived at his club that evening with his mind still occupied by the conversation in Miss Ashworth's library, the quality of her intellect settling into his awareness like something rare and unexpected discovered in a place he had not thought to look, and he found himself replaying certain moments from their exchange, the way her eyes had lit with genuine excitement when discussing the properties of belladonna alkaloids, the graceful precision of her hands as she turned pages of texts that clearly meant more to her than mere objects, the complete absence of artifice or calculation in her manner that stood in such stark contrast to the performances he endured in every ballroom and drawing-room in London. He had barely settled into a chair near the fire with a glass of port when Fitzwilliam and Chambers approached, with expressions that suggested they had been waiting for his arrival with some purpose. And Fitzwilliam opened the conversation with a casual observation that William had been notably absent from several recent social engagements, prompting Chambers to add with a smirk that perhaps the Viscount had found more compelling entertainment elsewhere, a comment weighted with implication that made William immediately wary. He deflected with some non-committal response about estate matters. But Chambers pressed forward with the false concern that characterized society gossip, noting that there had been some talk about William calling upon that peculiar Ashworth woman who had made such a spectacle at the auction house, the spinster with the unfortunate manner and no conversation worth enduring, and surely William must be pursuing some specific purpose to subject himself to such tedious company. William felt anger rise sharp and immediate in his chest, a protective instinct he had not anticipated and could not entirely explain, and he found himself responding with an edge that silenced the ambient conversation around them, observing that Miss Ashworth possessed more genuine intellect and worthwhile conversation than every young lady currently gracing London society combined, and that any man capable of recognizing substance over superficial accomplishment would consider her company a privilege rather than a burden. Fitzwilliam raised his eyebrows at the vehemence of this defense, while Chambers actually laughed, suggesting that William must be joking, or perhaps had been taken in by some pretense of learning, for everyone knew the woman was hopelessly unmarriageable and had nothing to recommend her but old books and a father whose eccentricities had left her quite unsuitable for proper society. William set down his glass with deliberate care and stated in a voice that carried unmistakable warning that he did not find the subject amusing, that Miss Ashworth was a scholar of genuine accomplishment whose understanding of botanical medicine exceeded that of most men claiming expertise in the field, and that anyone who found her unmarriageable was simply revealing their own inability to value qualities more lasting than a pretty face or fashionable accomplishments. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, his friends exchanging glances that suggested they found his reaction excessive and perhaps telling. And after an awkward moment, Fitzwilliam steered conversation to safer topics, while Chambers retreated with an expression mixing surprise and speculation. William remained another hour for propriety, but his thoughts were elsewhere, examining with growing awareness the strength of his response and what it revealed about feelings he had not yet named even to himself. And when he finally departed into the cool April evening, he carried with him the uncomfortable recognition that his interest in Eleanor Ashworth had moved beyond intellectual appreciation into territory far more dangerous and infinitely more compelling than he had intended to permit. The invitation arrived 3 days after their second meeting, delivered by liveried footman in the late morning when Eleanor was cataloguing specimens she had collected from the small garden behind her townhouse, and the heavy cardstock bore William's formal script inviting Miss Ashworth to accompany the Viscount to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew on the following Thursday morning to view the newly acquired specimens from the recent botanical expedition to South America, a collection not yet open to general public viewing, but accessible through connections William had cultivated with the institution's directors. Eleanor held the card for a long moment in her workroom, with its shelves of pressed plants and jars of seeds, aware that accepting meant stepping further into whatever strange territory this acquaintance represented, but the prospect of seeing specimens from the Amazon and the Andes proved stronger than her caution, and she penned her acceptance before prudence could intervene. Thursday arrived bright and unseasonably warm for early May, the kind of spring morning that carried the promise of summer in its golden light, and Eleanor dressed with more care than usual in a gown of pale green muslin that was several seasons old but had always pleased her for its simplicity, though she caught herself wondering whether William would find it dowdy before sternly reminding herself that his interest was scholarly and such considerations were both inappropriate and pointless. His carriage arrived precisely at the appointed hour, and he handed her in with courtesy that had become familiar, commenting on the fineness of the weather and the good fortune that rain had held off. But Eleanor sensed something lighter in his manner, a pleased anticipation that matched her own excitement about the expedition ahead. The journey to Kew took them through London streets, giving way gradually to more open country, and they fell into easy conversation about the botanical expedition's published findings, William revealing that he had read the preliminary reports with great interest and thought Miss Ashworth would particularly appreciate the documentation of medicinal plants used by indigenous peoples, knowledge that European science was only beginning to catalogue and understand. When they arrived at the gardens, the May morning had grown warm enough that Eleanor was grateful for the broad paths shaded by established trees, and William guided her not to the public areas, but to the research glasshouses where the new specimens were being carefully acclimated, introducing her to the curator as a fellow scholar whose expertise in medicinal botany would provide valuable perspective on the collection. The curator responded with respect that surprised Eleanor, clearly taking his cue from William's presentation, and soon she found herself standing before plants she had only read about in expedition journals, surrounded by the humid warmth of the glasshouse and the green living smell of tropical growth thriving in English soil. William watched her move from specimen to specimen with an attention she felt but tried to ignore, too absorbed in examining leaf structures and root systems to guard her expressions. And when she turned to ask him whether he had noticed the similarity between this particular vine's properties and those described in her medieval manuscript, she found him looking at her with such focused warmth that words momentarily failed her. They reached simultaneously for the same flowering plant, an orchid species whose blooms were said to have remarkable healing properties, and their hands brushed in the warm air of the glasshouse, neither immediately withdrawing, and Eleanor felt the contact like a shock through her entire body, an awareness that seemed to still the world around them. William's fingers moved slightly against hers, the barest acknowledgement of the touch, and when she finally looked up at his face, she saw there something that made her breath catch, a tenderness mixed with wonder that transformed his usually controlled expression into something openly vulnerable. He smiled at her with a gentleness that felt impossibly intimate, and said her name, just Eleanor without the formal address, and in that moment, surrounded by exotic blooms and filtered May sunlight, William Harcourt understood with absolute certainty that he was falling in love with this remarkable woman who saw beauty in botanical structures and found joy in the pursuit of knowledge, and the recognition both exhilarated and terrified him in equal measure. Eleanor returned home from Kew Gardens as the afternoon light was turning golden, and she moved through the remainder of that Thursday in a state of distracted awareness that made even her beloved research feel distant and unreal, the memory of William's touch against her hand in the glasshouse repeating itself in her mind with an insistence that grew more alarming as evening approached, and she found herself unable to concentrate on the specimen notes she had intended to catalogue. She ate a solitary dinner without tasting the food, and retired early to her small bedroom at the top of the house, the room that had been hers since childhood, and which had always felt like a sanctuary of comfortable solitude, but which now seemed to press against her with its familiar limitations, and she sat at the window looking out over the darkening rooftops of London, while her reflection looked back at her from the glass, a woman of 29 years with unremarkable features and unfashionable manner who had learned long ago to find contentment in intellectual pursuits rather than romantic possibilities. But contentment felt impossibly fragile now, threatened by the recognition of feelings she had not permitted herself in so many years, and Eleanor forced herself to examine with painful honesty what she had seen in William's face that afternoon, the warmth and tenderness that had seemed so unmistakably genuine in the moment, but which now, in the solitary darkness of her room, took on the quality of something she must have misinterpreted or foolishly magnified beyond its true significance. She rose and lit more candles against the gathering night, then sat at her small writing desk where she had composed so many letters to fellow scholars and botanical societies, and she made herself remember with deliberate cruelty the last time she had allowed herself to hope for romantic regard. That spring 7 years ago, when Mr. Edward Pemberton had seemed to seek her company at several gatherings, and she had been young enough and naive enough to believe his interest might be genuine. She remembered the afternoon she had overheard him at a garden party speaking to his friend with careless clarity about the Ashworth woman who was unfortunately plain and far too intellectual for any man to seriously consider, amusing enough for conversation when one was bored, but hardly the sort one would ever actually court, and certainly not when there were proper young ladies available who understood how to be decorative and agreeable without constantly mentioning books and plants, as though anyone truly cared about such tedious subjects. The memory still carried the power to wound after all these years, the sharp humiliation of having allowed herself to hope, and the deeper shame of having so thoroughly misread friendly courtesy as potential affection, and Eleanor had learned from that experience to guard herself more carefully, to accept her circumstances with dignity rather than reaching for possibilities that would only lead to greater pain. William Harcourt was a viscount, wealthy and respected, and able to have his choice of beautiful, accomplished young women who graced every ballroom in London, and while he might find her intellectually interesting as a novelty or a curiosity, Eleanor could not allow herself to believe that his attention meant anything more than the kind of scholarly appreciation one might feel for a particularly well-informed colleague. To think otherwise was to invite exactly the sort of humiliation she had promised herself to avoid, and as she sat in the candlelight, with London settling into sleep around her, Eleanor made the decision that felt like self-preservation, even as it tasted like loss, and she drew a sheet of writing paper toward her and began to compose a letter declining any further meetings with the Viscount, her hand steady even as something deep within her chest felt like it was quietly breaking. Eleanor's letter arrived at William's Mayfair residence on Friday morning, delivered by a street messenger rather than through proper channels, and he recognized her handwriting immediately on the plain sealed paper that his butler presented to him in hhis study, where he had been attempting to concentrate on correspondence from his estate manager, but finding his thoughts returning persistently to the previous day's excursion to Kew Gardens. He broke the seal with eagerness that turned quickly to dismay as he read her carefully composed words thanking him for his kindness and generosity in sharing his time and connections, but explaining that, upon reflection, she felt it would be inappropriate to continue meetings that might be misunderstood by society or prove distracting from the serious scholarly pursuits they both valued, and she hoped he would understand her decision and remember their brief acquaintance with the same intellectual appreciation she would always maintain for their conversations. William read the letter twice, then set it on his desk and sat back in his chair, recognizing immediately the fear behind the formal courtesy of her words, understanding that something had frightened her badly enough to retreat behind walls of propriety and self-protection. He thought of how she had looked in the glasshouse, surrounded by exotic blooms, the unguarded joy on her face as she examined each specimen, and then he thought of how that joy had transformed to startled awareness when their hands touched, and he understood, with sudden clarity, that Eleanor had recognized what was growing between them and had chosen to run from it rather than risk the vulnerability that hope required. The recognition filled him with a complicated mixture of frustration and tenderness, frustration that she would deny herself happiness out of fear, but tenderness for the wounds that had taught her such self-protection, and William knew with absolute certainty that he would not accept her dismissal because she deserved better than a life spent hiding from possibility. He drew a fresh sheet of paper toward him and began to write. Not the careful, formal response that society would dictate, but rather words that came from the uncomfortable honesty of genuine feeling, telling her that he understood her fear but could not honor her request, because doing so would require him to pretend that their acquaintance meant no more than casual scholarly interest, when the truth was that he found her remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with propriety or social expectation. He wrote that her mind was the finest he had encountered in years of being surrounded by educated people who rarely said anything worth remembering, that her passion for knowledge reminded him of why intellectual pursuit mattered beyond mere social accomplishment, and that her company had become something he looked forward to with an eagerness that surprised him as much as it apparently alarmed her. He sealed this letter with his family crest and added to it a package containing a rare first-edition botanical text he had acquired years ago and treasured, a 16th-century herbal with hand-colored illustrations that he knew she would appreciate not for its monetary value, but for its scientific and historical significance. Then William did something he had not done since he was a young man, newly come into his title and still unsure of social protocols, and he took both letter and package and went himself in the late morning to Eleanor's modest townhouse, arriving without prior notice or proper calling hours, and when her elderly housekeeper answered the door with surprise, he asked simply to see Miss Ashworth on a matter of some importance, his expression serious enough that the woman admitted him to the small front parlour and went to fetch her mistress. William stood in that parlour with its worn furniture and shelves of books, his fine coat and polished boots marking him clearly as out of place in this shabby, genteel household. And he felt more nervous than he had in years, because he understood that what happened in the next minutes might determine whether he would be allowed to pursue the most genuine connection he had felt with another person in longer than he cared to admit. Eleanor heard footsteps on the stairs and had only a moment to compose herself before Mrs. Davies appeared at her library door with an expression of flustered surprise to announce that Viscount Harcourt had called and was waiting in the parlour, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed defences waver at the knowledge that he had come himself rather than simply sending a reply to her letter of dismissal. She descended the narrow stairs with her heart beating uncomfortably fast and entered the small front parlour to find William standing near the window with a package under his arm, his fine clothing and aristocratic bearing making the shabby, genteel room seem even smaller and more worn, but his expression when he turned to face her held none of the superiority she had braced herself against, and instead showed only a direct seriousness that made it difficult to maintain her protective distance. He greeted her with proper formality, but requested permission to speak plainly, and when she nodded with more courage than she felt, he told her that he had received her letter and understood the fear behind it, but could not in good conscience pretend that their acquaintance meant no more to him than casual scholarly interest, when in truth she had become the most genuinely interesting person he had encountered in years of being surrounded by people who valued appearance over substance. Eleanor felt her throat tighten, but forced herself to respond that he was kind to say so. But surely he must understand that she was not the sort of woman a man of his position could seriously consider, that she was 29 years old and plain and far too intellectual, and that society would mock him endlessly for any attention he paid to someone so thoroughly unsuitable. William listened to this recitation with an expression that grew increasingly intense, and when she finished he asked her directly whether those were her own beliefs about her worth or simply society's judgments that she had learned to repeat, and the question struck her with unexpected force because she realized she no longer knew where the boundary lay between external cruelty and internalized shame. He moved closer then and told her with quiet conviction that he valued precisely those qualities that society dismissed, that her mind was extraordinary and her passion for knowledge was refreshing rather than tedious, and that her face when she looked at something that fascinated her held more genuine beauty than all the carefully arranged features of approved young ladies who had been taught to display pleasantness rather than feel actual emotion. Eleanor wanted desperately to believe him, but found herself listing more objections, telling him about Edward Pemberton and the humiliations of having once before mistaken friendly interest for genuine regard, explaining that she had learned to protect herself by accepting her limitations rather than reaching for possibilities that would only lead to greater pain. William's expression softened with understanding, but also something that looked like carefully restrained anger not at her, but at a world that had taught her to think of her finest qualities as defects, and he said that he could not speak to Mr. Pemberton's blindness, but he could speak to his own clarity of vision and his own growing certainty that she was precisely the sort of woman he wished to know better. He presented her then with the package he had brought, the rare herbal with its beautiful illustrations, and told her it was not a gift meant to obligate or persuade, but rather a gesture of respect from one scholar to another who would truly appreciate its significance. Eleanor took the book with trembling hands and felt something crack in her careful defenses, as she recognized the value of what he was offering both materially and symbolically, and when she looked up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears, he asked her with formal courtesy and unmistakable sincerity whether she would grant him permission to court her properly, to call upon her and escort her to appropriate entertainments and allow him the opportunity to prove that his regard was both genuine and enduring. Eleanor gave her answer in a voice barely above a whisper, granting him permission to court her, though part of her remained convinced that this would somehow end in disappointment. And William's expression transformed with relief, and something deeper that made her heart contract with cautious hope, even as her lifelong habits of self-protection warned her against believing too readily in possibilities that seemed too wonderful to be real. The courtship that followed over the next weeks unfolded with a gentleness that gradually eroded her defenses, beginning with proper afternoon calls where they sat in her small parlor discussing botanical classifications and the latest scientific publications, while Mrs. Davies served tea and observed with barely concealed approval, then progressing to public outings that announced to London society that Viscount Harcourt was indeed paying serious attention to the unfashionable spinster who had somehow captured his interest. They visited the British Museum on a Tuesday morning when the rooms were relatively quiet, and spent 2 hours examining the natural history collections, William watching with undisguised pleasure as Eleanor forgot her self-consciousness entirely, while explaining the classification systems her father had taught her, and pointing out errors in some of the specimen labels with the confidence of true expertise. They attended a lecture at the Royal Society, where William's membership granted them access, and Eleanor sat in the gallery designated for ladies, intensely aware of the whispered speculation her presence with the Viscount generated, but finding that her interest in the speaker's discussion of recent botanical discoveries in South America outweighed her discomfort at being observed and discussed. They spent an afternoon at Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, where William insisted on purchasing several new publications for her library, despite her protests about the expense, and Eleanor found herself laughing with genuine delight when he presented her with a particularly expensive illustrated volume and told her seriously that he considered it an investment in their future conversations, since she would undoubtedly share her insights about its contents with him. The formality that had characterized their early interactions gradually softened into something easier and more natural, titles giving way to given names when they were private, careful distance becoming comfortable proximity as they bent together over books and specimens, intellectual discussion flowing into more personal topics as William shared stories of his sister Catherine and his frustration with society's emptiness, while Eleanor found herself revealing memories of her father and her own struggles with loneliness, disguised as contentment. Society's reaction to their courtship ranged from cruel mockery to genuine curiosity, with some drawing rooms buzzing with speculation about what wager or peculiar whim motivated the Viscount's attention to such an unsuitable woman, while others began to reassess Eleanor with the grudging acknowledgement that perhaps she possessed some quality not immediately apparent that had captured the interest of a man known for intelligence and independence of mind. Eleanor heard the gossip because it was impossible not to hear it when matrons whispered behind fans and young ladies exchanged knowing glances. But she found that William's steady presence and evident genuine pleasure in her company provided armor against the cruelty she had once accepted as her natural lot. They were walking through Hyde Park on a May afternoon, warm with early summer promise, when the moment came that shifted something fundamental between them, strolling along a relatively quiet path, discussing the various trees they passed and their medicinal properties, when Eleanor stumbled slightly on an uneven patch of ground, and William caught her elbow to steady her, then did not immediately release his gentle hold. She looked up at him with a question in her eyes, and found him gazing at her with an expression of such tender regard that her breath caught, and then he lifted his free hand with careful deliberation and touched her cheek with his gloved fingers, a gesture so gentle and reverent that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, because no one had ever touched her with such obvious care, and she understood in that moment that whatever his reasons for pursuing this courtship, pity and obligation were not among them. The invitation to Lady Pemberton's garden party had arrived during the second week of June, and Eleanor had hesitated before accepting, because she knew that attending a large social gathering as William's acknowledged companion would expose her to levels of scrutiny and potential cruelty that their quieter outings had largely avoided. But William had encouraged her to attend with him, and promised that his sister Catherine would also be present to provide friendly support. So Eleanor had agreed, despite the anxious flutter in her stomach, whenever she thought about facing the assembled eyes of society with full awareness of their judgment. The afternoon proved as difficult as she had feared from the moment they arrived at the Pemberton estate in Kensington with its extensive gardens laid out in the fashionable style, William handing her down from the carriage with obvious care that drew immediate attention from the other guests gathered on the lawn, and Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes assessing her unfashionable dress and plain features, and undoubtedly finding her utterly unsuitable as the object of a viscount's regard. Catherine greeted them warmly and stayed close during the first hour as they moved through the party. But even her kind presence could not entirely shield Eleanor from the cuts both subtle and overt that came her way, ladies turning away when she approached as though she had become invisible, young gentlemen smirking behind their hands as she passed, groups of fashionable misses whispering and laughing in a manner that made their subject unmistakable. William remained attentive and seemed either unaware of the cruelty surrounding them or determined to ignore it, bringing her refreshments and introducing her to acquaintances with perfect courtesy that forced them to acknowledge her even if their responses held barely concealed disdain. But Eleanor felt her fragile confidence eroding with each pointed slight and dismissive glance until she felt raw and exposed in a way that reminded her painfully of why she had learned to avoid such gatherings entirely. The crisis came when William was called away to speak with their host about some matter of business, and Catherine had been drawn into conversation with an old friend, leaving Eleanor standing alone near the refreshment table, trying to appear composed and unconcerned while feeling utterly conspicuous in her solitude. She was reaching for a glass of lemonade when she heard her name spoken by a familiar voice behind one of the tall hedges that divided the garden into separate areas, and she froze with her hand outstretched as she recognized Lady Margaret Winters speaking to someone Eleanor could not see, their voices carrying clearly through the greenery as Margaret said that really the whole situation was quite extraordinary, and one had to wonder what wager or jest motivated Harcourt to pay such marked attention to that dreadfully plain spinster with her books and her complete lack of social graces. The other voice, belonging to someone Eleanor did not know, responded with a laugh and the observation that perhaps the Viscount had tired of beautiful women and decided to try something different as a sort of intellectual experiment, the way one might study an unusual specimen, and surely he would tire of the novelty soon enough and return to pursuing ladies appropriate to his station and expectations. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the full cruelty of the words struck her, all her deepest fears articulated with casual mockery, and she set down the glass she had been holding with a trembling hand and turned away from the refreshment table with only one thought, which was to escape before anyone could see the tears gathering hot behind her eyes. She moved quickly through the garden away from the main gathering of guests, following a path that led deeper into the ornamental plantings, where tall roses bloomed in profusion and the sounds of conversation faded to a distant murmur. And finally, she stopped in a secluded alcove formed by trained hedges and let the tears fall while her mind repeated the overheard conversation and added her own voice to the mockery, telling herself that she had been foolish to believe even for a moment that William's attention meant what she had begun to hope it meant. William found her standing in the alcove with her back to the path and her shoulders trembling with the tears she was trying to contain, and the sight of her distress struck him with a force that surprised him, even as he understood immediately that something cruel had happened, because Eleanor had been holding herself together so bravely throughout the afternoon, despite the treatment she had endured. He approached quietly and spoke her name with such gentleness that she startled and turned toward him, hastily wiping at her eyes with gloved hands in a futile attempt to hide the evidence of her tears. But William saw everything in her expression and felt anger kindle hot and fierce in his chest, not at Eleanor, but at whoever had reduced her to this pain. He stepped closer and asked what had happened, while keeping his voice carefully controlled, because he knew that displays of temper would only distress her further when what she needed was comfort and reassurance, and after a moment of visible struggle, Eleanor told him in a voice made unsteady by tears about the conversation she had overheard, and the speculation about wages and experiments, and his inevitable return to more suitable companions once the novelty wore thin. William felt the anger intensify into something cold and sharp as she spoke, because he understood now that all his careful attention and genuine regard had not been enough to shield her from the cruelty of people whose own emptiness made them incapable of recognizing true worth when they encountered it. And more than that, he understood that Eleanor believed what she had heard because it confirmed everything society had taught her about her own value. He took both her hands in his without asking permission and held them firmly, while telling her that every word she had overheard was poison spoken by people too shallow to understand what they were mocking, that there was no wager and no experiment, and no plan to abandon her once some imagined novelty faded, and that she needed to hear clearly what he had been trying to show her through his actions over these past weeks. Eleanor looked up at him with eyes still bright with tears, and shook her head as though trying to deny what he was saying, and William felt something break open in his chest as he realized that she genuinely could not conceive that his feelings might be real and deep and lasting because she had been taught too well to think herself unworthy of such regard. He said her name again and told her with complete sincerity that he loved her, that he had fallen in love with her intelligence and her passion and her quiet dignity, and the way she forgot herself entirely when discussing subjects that fascinated her, that he admired her more than any woman he had ever known because she possessed something far rarer than conventional beauty, which was integrity and depth of character and a mind that challenged and delighted him in equal measure. Eleanor's tears flowed harder at his words, but William pressed on because she needed to hear this truth, even if accepting it terrified her, telling her that society's judgment meant nothing to him except as it caused her pain, that he would court her and marry her if she would have him regardless of what anyone said or thought, because she was the woman he wanted beside him for the rest of his life. She protested through her tears that he was being kind, that he pitied her, that surely he could not truly prefer her to women who were beautiful and accomplished in the ways society valued. And William lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it with such reverence that she fell silent, then looked into her eyes and asked her to trust him, and to trust that his feelings were genuine and freely given, because the alternative was to let cruel voices win and destroy something rare and precious before it could fully bloom. Eleanor allowed William to lead her back along the garden path toward the sound of conversation and music that marked where the other guests gathered, her hand resting on his arm with fingers that still trembled slightly from the tears she had shed and the declaration she had heard, and though part of her wanted to ask William to take her home immediately so she might have time to absorb what had passed between them in the secluded alcove, she recognized that leaving now would look like retreat and would give the cruel voices ammunition for further mockery. As they emerged into the main area of the garden, where Lady Pemberton had arranged tables beneath white canopies and guests moved in clusters across the manicured lawn, Eleanor saw several heads turn in their direction and felt the familiar weight of assessing eyes. But before her courage could falter, William placed his hand over hers where it rested on his sleeve in a gesture of unmistakable claiming and support that sent a clear message to anyone observant enough to notice. They had barely taken 10 steps when Lady Margaret Winters approached with another lady. Eleanor did not know, and Margaret offered a smile that did not reach her eyes as she said how lovely it was to see dear Miss Ashworth looking so well, though the emphasis on the word dear carried an edge of mockery that Eleanor suspected was quite intentional. William stopped and regarded Margaret with an expression of such cool displeasure that the false smile wavered on the lady's face, and he said with perfect politeness that Miss Ashworth always looked well to those with eyes trained to see beyond surface appearances, and that he found her company infinitely more rewarding than that of ladies who cultivated beauty while neglecting substance. The cut was delivered with such aristocratic precision that Margaret actually took a step backward while colour flooded her cheeks, and her companion made some stammered excuse before pulling Margaret away toward the refreshment tables. leaving Eleanor staring at William in shock because she had never heard him speak so sharply in social company. He glanced down at her and asked quietly if he had overstepped, and Eleanor found herself shaking her head even as something warm and fierce bloomed in her chest at the realization that he had just publicly defended her in a manner that would be reported across London drawing rooms by tomorrow afternoon. They continued through the party with William maintaining his attentive posture and making several pointed remarks in various conversations that positioned Eleanor not as an oddity to be tolerated, but as a woman of intelligence and worth, whose company he actively sought and valued. And Eleanor watched as the dynamic around them slowly shifted, not because people suddenly recognized her value, but because William's clear regard forced them to reassess their treatment of her, or risk offending a man whose wealth and position gave him considerable social power. When young Lord Westbrook made a carelessly dismissive comment about women who fancied themselves scholars, William responded with such cutting eloquence about the poverty of minds that could not appreciate learning regardless of the form it took that Westbrook actually apologized. And when they finally took their leave an hour later, Eleanor felt dazed by how thoroughly William had used the very social structures that usually oppressed her to instead establish her right to respect. He handed her into his carriage with the same careful attention he had shown all afternoon and climbed in beside her. And once they were away from Pemberton House, he took her hand again and promised that he would continue to stand beside her and defend her, and demonstrate to anyone who cared to observe that his attachment was real and lasting, and would not waver regardless of what society whispered, because she deserved nothing less than absolute constancy from the man who loved her. Lady Catherine Harcourt received Eleanor in her elegant drawing-room with a warmth that took Eleanor completely by surprise, rising from her seat as William made the introduction and crossing the room to take both of Eleanor's hands in her own with a smile that reached her eyes and held nothing of the practiced politeness Eleanor had come to expect from society women. Catherine was perhaps 35, dark-haired like her brother, with the same clear grey eyes that seemed to see more than most people revealed, and she wore mourning colours softened by time into shades of lavender that suggested her widowhood was some years behind her now. And as she welcomed Eleanor and insisted she must sit in the most comfortable chair near the window where the afternoon light fell across shelves packed with books, Eleanor felt some of the tension she had carried into this meeting begin to ease, because there was nothing of judgment or assessment in Catherine's manner, but rather genuine pleasure at making her acquaintance. William had told Eleanor during the carriage ride to Catherine's residence in Bloomsbury that his sister was a woman of considerable learning who had married young to a man much older than herself and had been widowed after only 5 years of marriage, and that she now devoted herself to the education of her young daughter and to her own intellectual pursuits in a manner that society found nearly as peculiar as it found Eleanor's scholastic interests. And Eleanor had understood from the way he spoke that Catherine's approval mattered deeply to him, not simply because she was his sister, but because he respected her judgment and valued her opinion above that of nearly anyone else in his acquaintance. Catherine ordered tea and then settled into the chair opposite Eleanor's with an expression of interest that felt entirely authentic as she said that William had told her about Eleanor's work in botanical studies and about the magnificent manuscript Eleanor had acquired at auction, and she hoped Eleanor might be willing to discuss some of her research because Catherine herself maintained a considerable garden and had long been fascinated by the medicinal properties of plants, though her own education had been woefully inadequate for pursuing such studies in any systematic way. The words came naturally and without affectation, and Eleanor found herself responding with equal naturalness, explaining her current work, cataloguing the properties of various herbs mentioned in medieval texts, and comparing those historical applications with more recent botanical discoveries. And Catherine listened with focused attention that Eleanor recognized as the mark of a genuinely engaged mind rather than polite pretense. William watched them both with an expression of quiet satisfaction, and after several minutes he excused himself with the explanations that he had some business to attend to, but would return in an hour. And though Eleanor felt a moment of panic at being left alone with his sister, Catherine's easy manner made it impossible to sustain anxiety for long. Once William had departed, Catherine leaned forward slightly and said with complete frankness that her brother had spoken of Eleanor with more animation and genuine feeling than Catherine had heard from him in years, that she could see immediately why Eleanor had captured his attention and his heart, because there was an authenticity about her that was rare in their circles, where most people wore masks of propriety that concealed emptiness beneath. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks and started to demur, but Catherine shook her head and continued that she understood exactly what Eleanor must be facing from society, because Catherine herself had endured similar treatment after her husband's death, when she had chosen to pursue intellectual interests rather than seek another marriage. And she wanted Eleanor to know that she had an ally and a friend in Catherine, regardless of what anyone else might say or think. July unfolded with a golden warmth that seemed to Eleanor like a physical manifestation of the change happening within her own heart. And as the days passed in a succession of visits and outings and quiet hours spent in William's company or in correspondence with Catherine, who had begun including Eleanor in various intellectual gatherings at her Bloomsbury residence, Eleanor felt something she had not experienced since perhaps her early girlhood, before society had taught her to think of herself as inadequate and unworthy of the happiness other women seemed to claim so easily. The change was not in her appearance, for she still wore her simple muslins and tied her hair in the same unfashionable but practical style she had always preferred. And she still moved through society as a woman of 29 with no particular beauty to recommend her and no fortune to compensate for that lack. But something in the way she held herself had shifted in a manner subtle yet profound, as though William's steady regard and Catherine's genuine friendship had given her permission to occupy space in the world without apology. She found herself laughing more freely during their visits to bookshops, where William delighted in finding obscure botanical texts to present to her with mock ceremony, and she discovered that she could meet his eyes now without the constant fear that she would find pity or amusement there. And when they attended a lecture together at the Royal Society where her presence as a woman raised eyebrows among several of the gentlemen scholars, William's quiet pride in her questions during the discussion afterward made her feel not like an oddity to be tolerated, but like a valued intellectual companion whose insights enriched his own understanding. There were afternoons in Catherine's garden where the three of them would sit beneath the shade of an old oak and discuss everything from botany to poetry to the political questions of the day. And Eleanor found in these conversations a freedom she had never known before, the freedom to express her thoughts without constantly monitoring herself for signs that she had overstepped or revealed too much of the unfeminine learning that society found so distasteful in women. One particularly warm afternoon when William had brought a collection of pressed specimens from his estate in Gloucestershire for Eleanor to examine, their heads bent together over the delicate dried flowers as she identified each species and explained its properties. She had looked up to find him watching her face rather than the specimens, and the expression in his grey eyes had been so tender and so full of affection that she had felt her breath catch in her throat. He had reached across the small space between them to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture of such casual intimacy that it spoke of a future where such touches would be commonplace and unremarkable, and Eleanor had realized with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying that she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with this man who somehow saw value where the rest of the world saw only a plain spinster past her prime, and that she trusted him now in a way she had not believed herself capable of trusting anyone after so many years of disappointment and dismissal. The knowledge settled into her heart with the weight of certainty, and though the small voice of fear still whispered occasionally that this happiness could not last and that something would surely come to destroy it, Eleanor found herself believing for the first time that perhaps her story did not have to end in resignation and solitude after all. The musical evening at Lady Pemberton's residence in late July began pleasantly enough with Eleanor attending alongside William and Catherine. and Eleanor had begun to feel almost comfortable in such gatherings, now that William's consistent presence at her side had silenced some of the more vicious gossip, and Catherine's friendship had given her an ally among society's matrons. But that fragile comfort shattered the moment Lady Sophia Beaumont entered the drawing-room in a sweep of pale rose silk that seemed to catch every candle's light and turn it into a halo around her golden hair. Eleanor had heard William speak of Lady Sophia only once in passing as a woman he had escorted to various functions during the previous season, before his interest had apparently cooled, and he had stopped calling upon her. But William's brief mention had not prepared Eleanor for the reality of Sophia's extraordinary beauty, the kind of beauty that belonged in portrait galleries and romantic poetry, with her flawless complexion and blue eyes that seemed to hold depths of emotion even from across a crowded room. Sophia was perhaps 22 or 23, young enough that her loveliness still had the fresh perfection of youth unmarred by time or worry, and she moved through the gathering with the unconscious grace of someone who had never doubted her welcome in any space she chose to enter, and Eleanor felt all of her newfound confidence drain away as she watched heads turn to follow Sophia's progress and heard the murmurs of admiration that rippled through the assembled guests. William's expression when he noticed Sophia revealed nothing more than polite recognition, and he made no move to leave Eleanor's side or to seek Sophia out, but Sophia herself approached their small group near the pianoforte with a smile that managed to be both warm and somehow calculating as she greeted William with the easy familiarity of someone who had once held a claim to his attention. The introductions were performed with flawless courtesy, and Sophia acknowledged Eleanor with a smile that never quite reached those remarkable blue eyes, and though her words were perfectly proper, there was something in the way she looked at Eleanor that made Eleanor feel suddenly and acutely aware of every way in which she herself must appear wanting in comparison to this vision of youthful beauty. The evening continued with the planned musical performances, and Eleanor tried to focus on the music and on William's steady presence beside her, but she found her attention returning again and again to where Sophia sat across the room, surrounded by a cluster of admirers who seemed drawn to her light like moths to flame. During the interval before the final performance, Eleanor excused herself to step into the cooler air of the hallway, and it was there that she overheard Sophia's voice drifting from the partially open door of the small parlor just beyond, speaking to someone Eleanor could not see, but whose murmured responses suggested another young woman of Sophia's acquaintance. Sophia was saying that she found it quite extraordinary that William Harcourt had taken up with such an unlikely woman, and that while she supposed his interest in the scholarly spinster was amusing enough as a novelty, she could not imagine it would hold his attention for much longer, because men like William ultimately wanted wives who could grace their homes and bear their children and move through society with elegance. And surely he would eventually recognize that intellectual conversation could not compensate for all the other qualities Miss Ashworth so obviously lacked. The words hit Eleanor with the force of physical blows, and all of the old fears that she had begun to believe William's affection had vanquished came flooding back with renewed power. Eleanor returned home from Lady Pemberton's musical evening, with Sophia's words echoing in her mind like a terrible refrain that grew louder with each repetition, and she dismissed her maid earlier than usual because she could not bear the woman's cheerful chatter about how fine the Viscount looked and how fortunate Miss Ashworth was to have secured such an advantageous match. And once alone in her library, where she had spent so many contented years before William had entered her life and disrupted the careful equilibrium she had built around her solitude, Eleanor felt all of the careful confidence she had constructed over the past months crumble like a structure built on sand rather than solid foundation. She sat at her writing desk, where the lamp cast its circle of golden light across the polished wood surface, and she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper with hands that trembled slightly, and she told herself that what she was about to do was necessary and right, and the only reasonable course of action for a woman who had allowed herself to forget for a dangerous interval that fairy stories did not happen to plain spinsters of 29 with no fortune and no beauty to recommend them. Sophia was right, Eleanor thought, with a bitterness that tasted like ash in her mouth, because men like William ultimately wanted wives who could ornament their drawing rooms and bear their children and move through society with the kind of effortless grace that came from youth and beauty and the absolute certainty of one's place in the world. And while William might genuinely enjoy their intellectual conversations and might even feel a certain affection for her company, surely that could not be enough to sustain a marriage, or to compensate for all the ways in which Eleanor would fail to meet the expectations that society and his family and eventually William himself would have of a viscountess. She dipped her pen in the ink and began to write, forming the words that would release him from their courtship with as much dignity as she could muster, explaining that upon reflection she believed they would not suit and that she was grateful for his attention, but thought it best they discontinue their association before matters progressed any further. And she was midway through the second paragraph when she heard the sound of the door-knocker echoing through the quiet house with an urgency that suggested something more than a casual social call. Eleanor's hand stilled over the paper as she heard Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, moving through the hallway, and then there were voices at the door, and Eleanor recognized William's distinctive baritone even from this distance, and her heart began to pound with a mixture of dread and something that felt treacherously like hope even as she tried to suppress it. She heard Mrs. Davies protesting that the hour was late and Miss Ashworth had retired, but William's response was insistent, though she could not make out the specific words. And then there were footsteps approaching the library, and Eleanor barely had time to place her hand over the unfinished letter before William appeared in the doorway, still in his evening clothes, with his cravat slightly loosened and his dark hair disordered as though he had been running his hands through it, and his grey eyes found hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You left without saying goodbye," he said without preamble, and his voice held a note of concern that made Eleanor's carefully constructed resolve waver dangerously. "What has happened, Eleanor? What did someone say to put that look in your eyes?" Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest at his question, and all of the careful composure she had been trying to maintain shattered like glass under too much pressure, and before she could stop herself, the words came tumbling out in a rush that held all the pain and fear she had been carrying. "I overheard Lady Sophia speaking tonight," she said, and her voice sounded strange and thin to her own ears. "She said that your interest in me is merely a novelty that will fade once you realize that intellectual conversation cannot compensate for all the other qualities I lack. And she is right, William, because I have been foolish enough to forget what I am and what I am not, and to believe for a dangerous interval that someone like you could truly want someone like me for anything more than an amusing diversion from the monotony of society." William's expression transformed from concern to something that looked like fury, though Eleanor sensed immediately that his anger was not directed at her, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt before her chair so that his eyes were level with hers, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Do you know what I saw the first moment I noticed you at that auction house in April?" he asked, and his voice was low and fierce. "I saw a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, and had the courage to claim it despite every disapproving glance from people who could not begin to comprehend the value of what she pursued, and I saw intelligence and passion and a kind of quiet strength that I had never encountered in all my years of enduring society's vapid entertainments, and I knew in that instant that I needed to know who you were, because you represented something real in a world that increasingly felt like an elaborate performance signifying nothing." Eleanor tried to speak, but William continued, the words pouring from him with an urgency that suggested they had been building for some time. "Do you know why I purchased that entire auction house, Eleanor? It was not some calculated strategy or idle whim, but rather because after you walked away with that manuscript, I realized I had no way to find you again, and the thought of never seeing you again, or never knowing your name, or never having the opportunity to speak with you was suddenly intolerable. and so I did the only thing I could think of to obtain the information I needed to find you." He reached up and took her hands in his, and his touch was warm and solid and achingly gentle. "I have spent 34 years navigating society's expectations and playing the role assigned to me and enjoying none of it. And then I met you, and for the first time I understood what it meant to anticipate waking each morning because I might see you or speak with you or learn something new about how your remarkable mind works, and you think Sophia Beaumont or anyone else could possibly compare to that?" Eleanor felt tears beginning to slip down her cheeks as William continued. "I do not want a decorative wife who will grace my drawing rooms and bear my children while maintaining a polite distance and never challenging me or surprising me or making me feel truly alive," he said. "I want you, Eleanor Ashworth, with your passion for botanical studies and your habit of forgetting to eat when you are absorbed in research and your complete inability to suffer fools or to pretend interest in things that bore you. And I want the life we could build together as true partners rather than the hollow pantomime that society calls marriage." Eleanor stared at William through her tears and felt something shift inside her like a wall that had been built stone by careful stone over many years suddenly beginning to crumble. And she saw in his eyes a sincerity that could not be feigned or mistaken for mere politeness or temporary fascination. And she realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating that he truly meant every word he had spoken. "But William," she began, her voice still trembling with the residue of her earlier fear, "you could have anyone, someone young and beautiful who would bring you connections and fortune, and who would never embarrass you in society, or cause people to question your judgment. And I am none of those things, and I never will be, no matter how much you might wish it were otherwise." William's hands tightened around hers, and his expression held a tenderness mixed with frustration that made her breath catch. "Do you think I have not considered all of this?" he asked, and his voice was gentle but firm. "Do you think I am somehow unaware of what society expects, or what would be considered an advantageous match according to the narrow calculations that govern such matters? I have spent my entire adult life surrounded by beautiful, empty-headed women who have been trained since birth to be ornamental and agreeable and utterly predictable. And I have been bored beyond measure by every single one of them. And then I met you, and suddenly I understood what it meant to want to spend every available moment with another person simply for the pleasure of their company and their conversation and their unique way of seeing the world." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that looked worn and well cared for, and Eleanor's heart began to pound so hard she thought he must surely hear it. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," William said, as he opened the box to reveal a gold band set with a single emerald surrounded by small pearls. "And it is not the largest or most ostentatious piece in the family collection, but it was her favorite, because my grandfather chose it specifically for her, and not because it was expected or appropriate, but because the green reminded him of her eyes, and he wanted her to know that he saw her as she truly was." Eleanor looked at the ring, and then back at William's face, and felt the last of her resistance beginning to dissolve like morning mist under the strengthening sun. "My grandmother was considered an unusual choice for my grandfather, because she was the daughter of a country vicar with no fortune and no particular beauty to recommend her," William continued, "but she was the cleverest woman he had ever met, and the only person who could make him laugh until tears ran down his face, and they had 47 years of genuine partnership and happiness together before he died. And she told me once that the secret to their contentment was that they had chosen each other for the right reasons rather than the reasons society deemed acceptable." William shifted from kneeling before her chair to formally kneeling on one knee while still holding the ring box in one hand and her trembling fingers in the other. "Eleanor Ashworth," he said, and his voice held a solemnity that made the moment feel sacred. Will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Not because I need someone to fill a position or play a role, but because I love you exactly as you are, and I cannot imagine building a life with anyone else." Eleanor whispered yes, through her tears, and felt William slip the ring onto her finger, where it settled with a rightness that seemed to confirm what her heart had been trying to tell her for weeks. And then he was pulling her into his arms and holding her with a tenderness that made something inside her chest expand until she thought she might break apart from the sheer overwhelming force of it. And she understood in that moment that this was real and true and hers to keep. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post 3 days later in the formal language that such notices required, stating that Viscount William Harcourt of Thornfield Park was pleased to announce his engagement to Miss Eleanor Ashworth of Bloomsbury, and the words looked impossibly official and permanent in black ink on white paper, as though by committing the information to print they had made it irrevocable in a way that even William's proposal had not quite accomplished. The reaction across London society was immediate and varied, and in some quarters absolutely scandalous in its intensity, with Lady Pemberton declaring at her Thursday salon that she had never heard of anything so extraordinary in all her 60 years of observing the ton, while Mrs. Crawford whispered to anyone who would listen that there must be some hidden circumstance that would explain such an inexplicable choice, perhaps a secret fortune or family connection that had not yet come to light. Catherine Harcourt received the news with unrestrained delight, and arrived at Eleanor's townhouse within hours of the announcement, carrying an armful of fashion periodicals and a bottle of excellent champagne, declaring that they had much to discuss regarding wedding plans and trousseau and the many preparations required for Eleanor's introduction to society as the future Viscountess Harcourt, and her genuine warmth made Eleanor feel for the first time that she might actually have allies in the foreign territory she was about to enter. Eleanor's distant relatives emerged from years of polite neglect to send carefully worded letters of congratulation that could not quite conceal their astonishment that their poor blue-stocking relation had managed to secure not merely a husband, but a title and fortune beyond anything they might have imagined possible, and their transparent surprise might have stung had Eleanor not been so thoroughly insulated by her happiness and by William's unwavering presence at her side through every social challenge. The gossip continued unabated through the first weeks of August, with some observers expressing grudging admiration for the Viscount's unconventional choice, while others maintained that the whole affair must be some elaborate joke or temporary madness from which he would surely recover before any actual marriage took place. But William seemed entirely unconcerned by public opinion and took every opportunity to demonstrate his genuine attachment, whether society approved or not. The first public appearance as an officially engaged couple took place at the Theatre Royal on a warm evening in mid-August, when William handed Eleanor down from his carriage in full view of the assembled crowd and tucked her hand possessively into the crook of his arm as they walked through the entrance, and Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of curious and judgmental eyes following their progress, but found that with William solid and steady beside her, she could bear the scrutiny with something approaching equanimity, if not quite comfort. The weeks following the theatre appearance passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Eleanor feeling simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed as Catherine took charge of the wedding preparations with an efficiency that suggested she had been planning such an event for years, and Eleanor found herself swept along through fittings at the dressmaker and consultations with the florist, and endless discussions about guest lists and seating arrangements and 1,000 other details that she had never imagined would require such careful consideration. The transformation of her modest wardrobe into something befitting a future viscountess proved to be one of the more challenging aspects of the preparation, not because Eleanor particularly cared about fashion, but because, standing for hours while seamstresses pinned and adjusted and murmured among themselves, made her feel exposed and self-conscious in ways that reminded her uncomfortably of all the years she had been dismissed as plain and unfashionable, though Catherine's presence and encouraging commentary helped to ease the discomfort, and even occasionally made the process something approaching enjoyable. William remained a steady and reassuring presence throughout the chaos, appearing at Eleanor's townhouse each afternoon, regardless of his other obligations, and sitting patiently through discussions of flower arrangements and menu selections with an attentiveness that suggested he genuinely cared about these details rather than merely tolerating them for her sake, and his willingness to engage with even the smallest decisions made Eleanor feel valued in a way that had nothing to do with grand romantic gestures and everything to do with the quiet daily reality of partnership. The social challenges of her new position became apparent during a particularly trying afternoon call when Eleanor accompanied Catherine to visit several ladies of elevated rank who needed to be properly notified of the upcoming nuptials, and the thinly veiled condescension with which some of these women treated her made it clear that her transformation from overlooked spinster to viscountess would not automatically grant her acceptance or respect, though she also encountered a few genuinely kind women who seemed more interested in her botanical research than in judging her suitability for the title she was about to assume. Catherine proved to be an invaluable guide through the treacherous waters of society expectations, teaching Eleanor which rules could be gently bent and which must be observed with perfect precision, and explaining the intricate hierarchies and ancient grudges that governed interactions among the ton with a mixture of humor and pragmatism that made the whole system seem less intimidating and more like a complex game with learnable rules. Eleanor found herself growing in confidence as the weeks progressed, not through any change in her appearance or manner, but through the accumulating evidence that William's regard remained constant regardless of society's judgment, and that she had genuine allies who valued her for her mind and character rather than dismissing her as an unfortunate aberration in the natural order, and this growing assurance allowed her to move through social situations with more ease even when she encountered hostility or skepticism. The final fitting of her wedding dress took place on a golden afternoon in late August, when the modiste's shop was filled with amber light that made the cream silk seem to glow from within. And as Eleanor stood before the mirror and saw herself transformed into something that looked almost bridal, she felt a sudden rush of emotion that caught her completely unprepared, tears welling in her eyes as she finally allowed herself to believe that this impossible, beautiful future was truly going to be hers. The morning of September 15th dawned clear and bright, with sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of St. George's Church in Hanover Square, casting jeweled patterns of ruby and sapphire and emerald across the stone floor where Eleanor stood in the vestibule, clutching a bouquet of white roses and late summer lilies that trembled slightly in her hands. And she could hear the murmur of the assembled guests beyond the doors and the soft strains of music beginning, and Catherine beside her, adjusting the lace veil one final time, with fingers that were steadier than Eleanor's own, as she whispered that Eleanor looked absolutely beautiful and that William was the luckiest man in England. The church had been decorated with garlands of ivy and white flowers that filled the air with a delicate perfume. And as the doors opened, and Eleanor took her first step forward on Catherine's brother's arm, she saw the faces turning toward her with expressions ranging from genuine warmth to barely concealed skepticism to simple curiosity. But then her eyes found William, standing at the altar in his dark coat, with his cravat perfectly tied, and his face transformed by an expression of such open joy and wonder that everything else seemed to fade into insignificance. The walk down the aisle felt both impossibly long and over too quickly, each step bringing her closer to the moment that would irrevocably change everything. And she was aware of the weight of the cream silk gown moving around her legs and the cool air on her face where the veil did not quite cover, and the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. But mostly she was aware of William watching her approach with an intensity that made her feel seen and known and chosen in ways she had never imagined possible. When she reached the altar, and William took her hand, his fingers were warm and steady around hers, and she could see the emotion shining in his eyes as the vicar began the ceremony with the traditional words that had joined countless couples before them, but which now seemed to carry a weight and significance that was entirely their own. And when the moment came for William to repeat his vows, his voice was clear and firm, as he promised to love and honor and cherish her for all the days of his life. And Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as she heard the absolute conviction in those words. Her own vows emerged more quietly, but with equal sincerity, each word a commitment not just to the man standing before her, but to the life they would build together and to the possibility of happiness. She had finally learned to believe she deserved, and when William slipped the gold band onto her finger beside the engagement ring, it settled there with a sense of completion that seemed to resonate through her entire being. The vicar pronounced them man and wife, with a smile that suggested even he was moved by the emotion of the moment. And when William lifted her veil and kissed her gently, it was a kiss that spoke of reverence and promise and love. And as they turned to face the assembled guests, as Viscount and Viscountess Harcourt, Eleanor felt William's hand tighten on hers and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, and that knowledge filled her with a courage she had never possessed before. The wedding breakfast took place in the grand ballroom of William's London residence, where servants had transformed the space into something that resembled an enchanted garden, with garlands of white roses and ivy twining around every column and crystal chandeliers glittering overhead like captured starlight. And as Eleanor entered on William's arm, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, with that familiar mixture of curiosity and judgment, but also with something new that might have been a cautious respect, or at least an acknowledgement that she was now the Viscountess Harcourt, regardless of what society might have preferred. The long table groaned under the weight of an elaborate feast that Catherine had carefully orchestrated, with dishes ranging from delicate pastries to roasted meats to elaborate confections that seemed almost too beautiful to eat. And champagne flowed freely as guests found their assigned seats and began the careful social dance of a wedding breakfast, where every conversation carried multiple layers of meaning, and every toast could either elevate or subtly undermine, depending on the skill of the speaker. Eleanor found herself seated beside William at the head of the table, where she could observe the assembled company that represented a cross-section of London society, from genuinely warm friends like Catherine and a few of Eleanor's fellow scholars to obligatory attendees who had come more out of curiosity or social necessity than any real goodwill, and she caught fragments of conversation floating up from various points along the table, ranging from genuine congratulations to thinly veiled speculation about how long this unusual match would last. William seemed utterly at ease throughout the meal, conversing with guests on either side with that natural charm that had always come so effortlessly to him. But Eleanor noticed how frequently his hand found hers beneath the table, and how his eyes kept returning to her face, as though reassuring himself that she was truly there and truly his. And these small gestures of connection helped to anchor her through the social complexity of the occasion. When the final course had been cleared away, and the moment came for the traditional toasts, William rose to his feet with his champagne glass in hand, and a sudden hush fell over the room as everyone waited to hear what the Viscount would say about his unconventional bride, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to race, with a fear that he might offer some tepid conventional sentiment that would leave room for society to continue doubting the authenticity of his regard. Instead, William's voice rang out clear and firm as he spoke, not of Eleanor's beauty or charm or any of the usual attributes praised in wedding toasts, but of her brilliant mind and her dedication to expanding human knowledge and her courage in pursuing intellectual truth regardless of society's dismissiveness. And he declared that he considered himself the most fortunate man in England, not because he had married well in the conventional sense, but because he had found a partner who challenged him to think more deeply and live more authentically and see the world with fresh eyes. The effect of this speech on the assembled guests was visible and immediate, with some looking genuinely moved, while others appeared uncomfortable at having their assumptions so directly challenged, but Eleanor saw several women dabbing at their eyes, and a few of the scholars present nodding in vigorous approval. And when William concluded by raising his glass to the most remarkable woman he had ever known, the toast was echoed with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm from at least half the room. Later, when the formal receiving of guests had concluded, and the crowd had fragmented into smaller conversational groups, William drew Eleanor into a quiet alcove behind a screen of potted palms where they could steal a moment of privacy, and he kissed her forehead gently and asked if she was ready to begin their wedding journey. And Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that shone with happy tears and said that she had never been more ready for anything in her life. The journey north to William's country estate in the Lake District took 3 days by private carriage, and Eleanor watched the landscape transform through the window as they travelled from the crowded, smoky streets of London, through rolling farmland, and eventually into the dramatic countryside of mountains and lakes that seemed to belong to another world entirely. And William sat beside her, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about his childhood visits to the estate, while his hand remained intertwined with hers in a casual intimacy that still felt wonderfully novel and precious. The estate itself came into view on a golden September afternoon, with the house situated on a gentle rise overlooking Windermere, with gardens that cascaded down toward the water in terraces of late summer flowers and ancient trees that provided shaded walks. And as the carriage pulled up the curved drive, Eleanor felt her breath catch at the beauty of it all, and at the realization that this was now her home as much as William's, and that they had weeks of uninterrupted privacy ahead to simply be together without the constant scrutiny of London society. The staff had prepared the house beautifully, with flowers in every room and fires laid against the evening chill, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, greeted them with genuine warmth that suggested William had chosen his country staff for kindness rather than rigid formality. And after a light supper served in the intimate breakfast room rather than the formal dining hall, William led Eleanor through the house, showing her the library that occupied the entire east wing, with floor-to-ceiling shelves and comfortable chairs positioned to catch the afternoon light, and windows that overlooked the lake. That first evening they sat together in the library, as twilight deepened outside, and talked about everything and nothing while the fire crackled in the hearth. And there was a quality to the conversation that felt different from their exchanges in London, because here there was no need to guard their words or measure their time or present themselves for public consumption. And when William finally drew her to her feet and led her upstairs to the suite of rooms that would be theirs, Eleanor felt her heart racing with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation and trust. The physical intimacy of marriage was a revelation not just in sensation, but in the profound vulnerability and connection it represented. And William was patient and tender in ways that made Eleanor feel cherished rather than merely desired. And afterward, as she lay in his arms, listening to his breathing steady into sleep, she felt tears sliding down her temples, because she had never imagined she could feel this safe and wanted, and completely accepted in all her complexity. The days that followed developed a rhythm of their own, with mornings spent exploring the extensive grounds where William showed her the wild areas where unusual plants grew and where they collected specimens for Eleanor's studies, and afternoons in the library where they read companionably or discussed William's plans for improvements to the estate that would benefit his tenants, and evenings spent in conversation or music or simply sitting together watching the light change over the lake. Eleanor discovered that marriage to William meant not the loss of her intellectual self, but rather the expansion of it, because he actively encouraged her work and had arranged for the library to include the latest botanical texts, and had even corresponded with several scholars on her behalf about research collaborations. And this thoughtfulness touched her more deeply than any romantic gesture, because it showed that he truly understood what mattered to her and valued it as much as she did. There were moments of pure joy, like the morning they walked to the lake shore before dawn to watch the mist rise off the water, and William wrapped his coat around her shoulders against the chill and kissed her temple and said he had never been happier. And there were moments of quiet contentment, like the afternoons spent reading side by side, with no need for conversation because their companionship was enough. And through all of it, Eleanor felt something in her chest loosening and expanding, as though a tightness she had carried for years was finally releasing. One evening, near the end of their third week at the estate, they sat together on the terrace, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, and William asked if she was happy, and Eleanor turned to look at him with tears shining in her eyes, and said that happy seemed an inadequate word for the fullness she felt. And then she said something she had never said to anyone before, which was that she had spent so many years believing she was too much of some things and not enough of others. But with him she finally felt like she was exactly enough, exactly as she was. And William pulled her close and said that she had always been enough and more than enough, and that the failure had been in those who could not see it. Their return to London in mid-October marked a transition that Eleanor had both anticipated and quietly dreaded, because while she had blossomed in the privacy of the Lake District, she knew that navigating society as the new Viscountess Harcourt would present challenges entirely different from those she had faced as the overlooked spinster Miss Ashworth, and yet as their carriage rolled through the familiar streets toward the Mayfair residence, she felt a steadiness within herself that had not existed before her marriage, because William's love had given her a foundation from which to face whatever judgment or curiosity society might direct her way. The first test came within days, when they attended a musical hosted by one of the leading hostesses of the ton, and Eleanor felt the familiar prickle of awareness as conversations paused when they entered, and eyes tracked their progress across the room. But this time, when she took her seat beside William, she noticed that several ladies who had previously ignored her now inclined their heads in acknowledgement, and that the whispers seemed less cruel and more speculative, as though society was still attempting to understand this unusual match but could no longer simply dismiss it. William remained constantly attentive without being overly protective, allowing Eleanor to navigate conversations on her own while positioning himself close enough to intervene if needed, and she discovered that her new position as Viscountess granted her a voice that had been denied to her as a mere scholarly spinster. Because when she spoke now about botanical research or recent scientific discoveries, people actually listened rather than exchanging amused glances over her unfeminine interests. The transformation was not universal, and there were still those who regarded her with barely concealed disdain, or who clearly considered William's choice a regrettable eccentricity. But Eleanor found that these judgments touched her less deeply now because she carried within herself the knowledge of William's love and respect and the memory of their weeks together in the Lake District, where she had been valued exactly as she was. She began to use her new social position deliberately to support other women who existed on the margins of acceptability, inviting female scholars and artists to small gatherings at the Mayfair residence and introducing them to members of society who might prove more open-minded than most, and she felt a deep satisfaction in creating spaces where intellectual conversation could flourish without the usual social constraints. William watched these efforts with visible pride and told her one evening as they prepared for bed that she was exactly the kind of Viscountess he had hoped she would become, using her position not to conform to society's expectations but to gently reshape what was considered acceptable, and his words warmed her more than any conventional compliment about her appearance or social grace ever could have done. There were still moments when the old insecurities surfaced, like the afternoon when she overheard two young ladies speculating about how long it would be before the Viscount tired of his blue-stocking bride. But Eleanor found that she could now hear such remarks without being devastated by them, because William's constancy had taught her to trust in the reality of their connection rather than in the opinions of those who could not understand it. The rhythm of their London life developed into something that balanced social obligations with private pleasures, with mornings often spent in the library, where Eleanor continued her research while William attended to estate business, and afternoons devoted to calls and engagements that their position required, and evenings that were sometimes spent in society, but just as often in quiet domesticity, with books and conversation and the easy intimacy of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. On a cool October evening after they had returned from a particularly tedious dinner party, William drew Eleanor into his study and poured them both a small glass of brandy and asked if she was happy with their life in London or if she preferred the solitude of the country estate, and Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering that she was discovering she could be happy in either place as long as they were together, because what she had feared losing in marriage was her sense of self. But what she had actually gained was a partner who helped her become more fully herself. Eleanor's first salon took place on a cold November evening when fires blazed in every hearth of the drawing room, and the medieval manuscript that had started everything sat displayed in a place of honor on a pedestal near the windows where guests could examine it throughout the evening, and she had spent weeks planning the gathering with meticulous care to create an environment where genuine intellectual exchange could flourish without the usual social posturing that dominated most London gatherings. The guest list itself had been an exercise in careful diplomacy, with a mixture of established scholars who would provide intellectual weight, progressive members of the ton who genuinely valued learning, several blue-stocking women who rarely received invitations to fashionable gatherings, and a strategic selection of society figures whose attendance would lend the event credibility and whose minds might actually be opened by exposure to serious discourse. William had supported every aspect of the planning, from helping Eleanor identify which scholars to invite, to ensuring the library was opened so guests could browse the extensive collection. And on the evening itself, he stood beside her as they greeted arrivals, and his presence gave her confidence, even as her stomach fluttered with nervousness about whether this experiment would succeed or become simply another source of mockery. The guests began arriving promptly at 8, and Eleanor felt her anxiety ease somewhat as she watched people genuinely engage with the displayed manuscript and begin conversations about botanical classification and medieval scientific methods, and Dr. Thornley from the Royal Society spent nearly 20 minutes examining the illustrations while discussing their accuracy with a young female botanist Eleanor had specifically invited because her work was brilliant despite society's dismissal of her sex. Lady Sophia arrived fashionably late in a gown of sapphire silk that made Eleanor acutely aware of her own simpler dove-grey dress. But rather than the smug superiority Sophia had displayed at their previous encounters, there was now a careful neutrality in her expression as she approached to greet the hostess and address her correctly as Viscountess Harcourt, with a curtsy that acknowledged Eleanor's superior social position. Eleanor received the greeting with gracious politeness that revealed none of the satisfaction she felt at this reversal of their circumstances, and she watched as Sophia moved through the room, clearly uncertain how to navigate a gathering where beauty and fashion mattered less than the ability to contribute to discussions of scientific advancement and literary analysis. The evening progressed with a warmth and energy that exceeded Eleanor's hopes as conversations flowed, and barriers between scholars and society figures began to dissolve in the face of shared intellectual curiosity. And she moved through the room facilitating introductions and drawing quieter guests into discussions, while William worked similar magic from his position near the refreshment table where he was explaining agricultural innovations to a group of younger gentlemen. There was a moment near 10 when Eleanor paused near the manuscript display and simply observed the scene she had created with scholars and ladies and gentlemen all engaged in animated discussion, without regard for the usual social hierarchies, and she felt tears prick her eyes at the realization that she was using her position exactly as she had hoped to create spaces where minds mattered more than appearances or age or gender. The guests began departing near midnight with numerous expressions of gratitude and requests for future gatherings, and even Lady Sophia paused in her departure to acknowledge that the evening had been surprisingly enlightening before sweeping out in a rustle of expensive silk. When the last guest had finally gone and the servants had been dismissed and the house settled into quiet, Eleanor found William in the library where he sat with the medieval manuscript open before him, and when she entered, He looked up with such pride and love in his expression that she felt her heart might overflow, and he drew her onto his lap, despite the impropriety, and said that she had been magnificent and had created exactly the kind of evening that would be talked about for weeks and that might actually begin to shift what was considered acceptable in their social sphere. The autumn of 1819 arrived with a crispness in the air that Eleanor had always loved, and she found herself standing at the window of the drawing-room in William's country estate, watching golden leaves drift from the ancient oaks that lined the drive, while one hand rested unconsciously on the subtle swell of her abdomen where their first child grew and transformed her body in ways that filled her with wonder and occasional trepidation about the journey ahead. They had retreated to the Lake District in late September when the London season ended, and Eleanor had felt such relief to return to this place where she and William had spent their honeymoon, and where she felt most fully herself, without the constant awareness of society's scrutinizing gaze. And it was here in the peace of the countryside that she had first suspected her condition, and had it confirmed by the local physician who had smiled kindly and told her that she seemed in excellent health for the rigors ahead. William had received the news with such unguarded joy that Eleanor had felt tears spring to her eyes as he gathered her carefully into his arms and buried his face against her hair and whispered that she had already given him more happiness than he had believed possible, and now she was giving him this gift as well. And in that moment, she had felt the last remnants of her old insecurities finally dissolve, because his love had proven constant through every season and circumstance. Now, as November approached and her body continued its subtle changes, she found herself reflecting often on how completely her life had transformed in the 18 months since that April afternoon when she had outbid an unknown viscount for a medieval manuscript and set in motion a series of events that had seemed impossible, even in her most secret hopes. She heard William's footsteps in the hall and turned from the window as he entered, carrying a bouquet of late-blooming roses from the greenhouse, and his face lit with the smile he reserved only for her, and he crossed the room to kiss her forehead before presenting the flowers with exaggerated formality that made her laugh. They had developed a habit of walking the estate gardens each afternoon, regardless of weather, and so Eleanor fetched her warmest shawl, and they ventured outside into the crisp air where the flower beds had been prepared for winter, but the paths remained clear and inviting, as they wound through grounds that would belong to their child someday. William took her hand as they walked and asked how she was feeling and whether she had experienced any discomfort, and his concern was so genuine and tender that Eleanor squeezed his fingers and assured him she felt remarkably well and was simply in awe of the changes happening within her body. They paused near the small reflecting pool where swans glided serenely, and William turned to face her fully and said that he had been thinking about that day at the auction house and how close he had come to never knowing her, because if she had not bid against him, or if he had not been intrigued enough to take the extraordinary step of purchasing the building just to learn her identity, their paths might never have crossed in any meaningful way. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion as she responded that she had spent so many years resigned to living on the margins of society, finding what fulfillment she could in scholarship, and never imagining that someone would see her as he did, or love her as he did. And now she stood here as his wife, carrying his child in a life so full of joy and purpose that her younger self would not have believed it possible. The spring of 1825 arrived with a brilliance that seemed to illuminate every corner of the Lake District estate, and Eleanor stood at the window of the library, watching her two children play in the garden below as 5-year-old Margaret examined flowers with the same intense focus her mother brought to botanical studies, while 3-year-old Thomas chased butterflies with unself-conscious delight, and their laughter drifted through the open window on air sweet with apple blossoms. William entered the room behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder as they observed their children together, and he murmured that Margaret had already asked 6 questions about plant classification that morning, and would clearly inherit her mother's scholarly inclinations. And Eleanor leaned back against him with profound contentment as she reflected on how the terrified, lonely woman who had attended that auction 7 years ago could never have imagined this abundance of love and purpose and family. The medieval manuscript that had brought them together sat in its place of honor in the library, where it had contributed to 2 published papers on historical botanical knowledge and had been examined by scholars from across Europe who came to consult with the Viscountess Harcourt, whose reputation for serious scholarship had only grown with time and position. And Eleanor had used her role to champion other women scholars and to create spaces where intellectual merit mattered more than social expectations. But now, as spring sunshine warmed the room and children's laughter filled the air, Eleanor wanted to step beyond the particulars of her story to speak directly to you who have listened to this journey from that auction house to this moment of fulfillment. Because perhaps you see yourself in the woman she was then. Perhaps you have been told you are too old or too plain or too unconventional or too intellectual or simply too much of whatever society has decided is unacceptable in your particular moment and circumstances. She wanted you to know that worth is not determined by whether you fit into narrow categories that others construct, or by whether you arrive at certain life milestones according to prescribed timelines, and that the most extraordinary transformations often come not when we change ourselves to meet external expectations, but when we find those rare souls who recognize and treasure exactly who we already are. It is never too late for new beginnings, and love can find you in the most unexpected moments when you are simply living authentically and pursuing what genuinely matters to you rather than performing acceptability for audiences who will never truly see you anyway. Eleanor's story began at 29 when society had written her off completely, and William's determination to know her had required purchasing an entire building just to learn her name. And if such extraordinary measures were necessary to bring them together, then perhaps your own story will unfold through equally unexpected channels and unlikely encounters that you cannot yet imagine. So if you find yourself standing where Eleanor once stood, dismissed or overlooked or resigned to a smaller life than your heart truly desires, please hold on to hope that your worth exists independent of recognition and that someone may yet see you truly and love you wholly. This community exists to remind you that transformation remains possible and that the most beautiful chapters sometimes begin precisely when you have stopped expecting them. And if this story has touched you, then stay connected for more journeys of unlikely love and hard-won happiness and the triumph of being genuinely seen at last.